13. The weather deteriorated during the drive home. It was early April and winter was fighting off spring's advances. That night, a chilly rain fell in the early evening, and by the time I got home, the temperature had dipped below 40 degrees. As I pulled into the driveway, sleet materialized. I'd stopped by the grocery store for a few provisions on my way home, and was reviewing a taco recipe in my head as I gathered the bags from the passenger seat. To avoid multiple trips, I lined my arms with the 6 bags and sprinted for the house. After a slight fumble with my keys, I opened the door and rushed into the darkness, setting the bags on the floor in front of the refrigerator. A slight creak sent my intruder radar into overdrive. As I came back to an upright position, I grabbed my gun and spun around to face the door. "Don't move," I yelled. Madeline Price was standing just inside the door, soaked and distraught. Her chest was heaving up and down, and her bun was uncharacteristically wild and out of place. "Please, Mrs. Wilcox, I'm in danger. I need help." Unwilling to remove my hands from the gun, I slid my elbow along the edge of the wall and pushed the light switch. "Come in." Madeline dropped her arms to her sides. "Keep your hands up," I commanded. She obliged. "Close the door and apply the deadbolt. After that, get a chair from the living room and set it in the middle of the kitchen floor." Madeline followed my instructions, walking carefully into the living room and slowly picking up a chair. She brought it into the kitchen. "Okay. Sit down nice and slow." The gun remained trained on Madeline's chest. It was still possible that Madeline had killed Liza. I couldn't take any chances. "I'm going to put the gun away. Then you're going to tell me why you put yourself in danger by sneaking to my place." "I didn't know where else to go," Madeline responded, tears mixing with the raindrops on her face. "What happened to you? Are you hurt?" I reached for her shoulder, but she pulled away. Her face had a look of pure terror, as if she'd seen a ghost. "I'm ready." I knew what she meant. Finally, she would tell me the truth. "Okay. Come into the living room. You're shivering and it's warmer in there." I put my gun away and pulled one of the Afghans out of the hall closet. Madeline eased into a chair, pulling the blanket round her as tightly as she could. She looked like a terrified child. "You're safe here. If they come here, they won't be leaving, and they won't have time to hurt you." "You don't understand. He could order someone to hurt anyone, and they would do it. He knows so much and she stopped mid-sentence and began to sob. "Calm down. I'll put on some tea," I said before heading into the kitchen. I took my time putting the kettle on the stove and getting cups out of the cupboard, giving her time to cry it out. By the time I had returned with 2 cups of ginger tea, she was calm. I set down the cups and threw a few logs into the fireplace. It only took a couple of minutes to get a nice fire going. "We're going to need more than 1 cup." I nodded and climbed into my leather recliner. "You can have as much tea as you need. I think you came here to tell me something." Madeline nodded and sighed, took the cup of tea and started from what I assumed was the beginning. At first, we were brutal enemies. We would face off from time to time with silly catfights that always began with, "You stole my man." Madeline dropped her head and laughed. It was in that second of reminiscing that she looked close to her age. DeMario was a looker who turned out to be a dangerous person, a psychopath. He was abusive and relentless. Liza once ran to the Upper Peninsula to get away from him. You might think, wow, she overreacted, but DeMario truly was a monster. He'd done such horrible things to Liza. After she moved to New Orleans, she sent me an anonymous letter. It was 5 pages long, and it could have passed for junk mail. I don't even remember why I opened it. I was haunted by the letter. It was a cry for help, but I had no idea who had sent it. "How did you know it was from Liza?" I didn't, until a month later when she sent me an email. All it said was, "It was me." After that, I decided to help. Why? I don't know. I guess I felt some connection with Liza. Kara came first, but Liza had her baby, another girl, about a year later. She was too scared to tell her parents. Instead, she left the baby with Damario's sister and went back home. So, she abandoned the baby. Did you ever hear what happened to the little girl? Madeline shook her head. I noted that this story differed slightly from what Alyssa Masters had told me had happened to Damario and Liza's child. I was fed up with Madeline's lies. Okay, I need to hear the entire story, don't lie to me. Start from the beginning and leave nothing out. The kettle whistled again. I retrieved it and refilled our cups. As I was handing the tea to Madeline, I noticed how small and scared she looked, nothing like the woman I'd met with several times at the yoga studio. You don't need to know everything. Yes, I do. I need to know everything because you never know what's relevant until it's revealed, I said, getting frustrated with the game Madeline was trying to play. I know if information is relevant or... Do you want the cops involved? You can deal with them instead of me. Your whole secret life will be out in the open. Is that what you want? You don't understand. There are so many lives in danger. Exposing me would harm so many young innocent women. I know about the cottage and the little group with the women and children, or whatever the hell you're running. I don't really care what you do in your free time, but I want to know what happened to Liza Stark. Okay. I'll start from the beginning, but I need your word that you won't hurt the innocent people involved. If they're innocent, there's no reason to worry. Start talking. She sighed and paused before beginning. It started when I was in high school. Damario began beating me after we moved in together. I was an honor student doing well in life, but when I met him, I thought I was in love. He was older, attractive, and interesting. When I got pregnant, my parents wanted nothing to do with me. They told me I couldn't live with them anymore, so Damario encouraged me to get on public assistance. Once I had that, a social worker helped me find a house in Brightmoor. There was a family that owned houses there, and they wanted to help young single mothers. Let me guess, the Abernathys. Madeline nodded. Yes. They were my landlords. That explained why they had such a high opinion of Madeline. She'd come a long way from being a teenage mom. Keep talking, I said. At one of my prenatal appointments, the doctor noticed bruises on my arms and neck. She gave me the number of a women's shelter, but they had stipulations. I wanted freedom without the psychobabble, the labels, and the sad reality that I was weak. What I wanted was an escape, a fresh start with my baby. I hesitated for a while, but after Kara was born, Damario would not change. I stayed in the relationship too long, but as soon as I graduated, I was ready to go. Liza was getting ready to have her baby, and I just wanted out of the situation. How did you get away from Damario? I was struggling to finish high school. I was still with Damario, and we had a child. He was beating the hell out of me, and I also knew that he had corrupted my landlord's daughter. She was pregnant and living around the corner. I couldn't get away without help, but I didn't have anyone. I started going to this church called Precious Blood, and I met an elderly couple, Sharon and Raymond Carter. They took to me and the baby instantly. It was like they knew I was hurting. They ran a safe house for young women who had run away from home, were pregnant, or were being abused. So they took you in, I interjected. Well, they tried twice, but both times Damario found me. That put all the girls in danger, so the Carters had to turn me away. Sharon tried to convince Raymond that they could ensure the safety of all of us, but he knew that wasn't true. One Sunday after church, Raymond slipped me a piece of paper with a phone number. I asked whose number it was because there wasn't a name. He told me to just call the number. They were expecting me. The number was for a group that would help you escape and leave the state. Yes. I called the number the next day. The person who picked up on the other end didn't go into detail. She just paused for a second before saying, "Meet me at the old train station. Come alone. Bring your baby." When I got there, I climbed into the car with Kara, and the person behind the wheel told me I was never going back. It's an organization for battered women and children, an underground railroad. Something like that. People wanted to help, and I knew I was indebted to them for what they had done for me. After I was back on my feet, I figured I should give back. I wasn't sure how until I received this anonymous letter. Before that, I just volunteered for a shelter, but those places have so many rules and stipulations. I wanted to do something more. Anyway, the letter Liza sent detailed horrific abuse, but it wasn't signed. It haunted me for months, but I had no way of finding out who sent it. Eventually, I received the email from Liza. Liza was the inspiration for your organization? No. I had already been working with organizations that helped battered women, but I wanted my own thing. Over time, I found I didn't like all the stipulations. Some groups require group therapy, labels, etc. I wanted to start something because I'd been one of those girls, and I wanted an organization that was a bit more empowering for women. I started with girls from Brightmoor. Liza was the first out-of-state rescue. You've been doing this for years? How can you afford to take care of all the women and children? The women are free to stay with us without worrying about anything for the first 3 months. After that, they pay $100 a month for utilities, rent, etc. There are very strict rules. They don't leave the safe house, and they aren't allowed to have any communication with outsiders. After 3 months, they're able to go out and find a job. We give them aliases, and we have a few employers in town that we work with. They know very little about the operation, but they know me, so they're willing to take a chance. They forge the necessary paperwork, but I provide proof that the women are eligible to work in this country. They need to be untraceable for a while. We take 20% off the top to keep the operation functioning, and the women can keep the rest of their money. Most of the time there is a surplus, and we use the excess to fund the resettlement of the women. That sounds good, but I doubt that you're able to pay for everything these women need, the houses, food, clothes, etc., with just 20% of their incomes. Income from the yoga studio supplements that. And your salary. That's why you pick up the therapy sessions now and then, isn't it? Madeline refused to confirm or deny the allegations. There was a great sense of selflessness in her. Was it inspired by altruism or guilt? You haven't had any trouble with the ladies not complying? They are helpless by the time they think they need a drastic escape plan, so they are very compliant. A few have had trouble with the structure, but after a couple of weeks they comply. Let's face it, refusal to comply means you're on your own, which means going back to the abuser. How long do they stay? Most of the girls have enough money to get their own place within 6 months. Do most of them leave after 6 months? Most stay at least a year. Because you're good to them. Madeline pulled the Afghan tighter and shook her head. I owe debts that can never be repaid. Helping these girls is the least I can do. So walk me through this. How did they find you? Chatrooms, college cafeterias, or, and I'm not proud of this, even on the dark web. I know there's a stigma, but think about it, all the criminals are on the dark web. Some of the victims are on there as well. Really? What are the victims doing on there? They stumble upon it. Young women, teenagers curious about what they can find on there. They get sucked in, but if they come across one of my forum spies, they can be saved. Well, at least some of them. The dark web, Michigan, Louisiana. Where else did Madeline have a presence? I realized I was dealing with something much bigger than a former abused woman gone rogue. I was dealing with a highly organized, far-reaching organization. Madeline Price wasn't the person I thought she was. Archie Paladowski's words echoed in my head. It was all very fascinating, but I felt my number one suspect slipping away. Did you stop by to see my priest? Madeline tilted her head and wrinkled her brow. What? No. Why would I go to see your priest? Someone fitting your description stopped by my church to ask questions about me. My priest described a small black woman with her hair in a bun. I assumed it was you. Why would I do that? I have no idea why, I just suspected it was you. If it wasn't her, who was it? Did you follow me to the hospital when I met with Dr. Freeman? Madeline hesitated before answering. Dr. Freeman is a friend. She helps with things, and we knew you were getting close to finding out what we do. Well, we were nervous and we thought that if we helped you understand that this was just a random act of violence, you would stop digging into my past. That explained Dr. Freeman's lie about returning a phone call, but it didn't clear up why someone had stopped by to see Father Keegan. Madeline was the only person I could think of, but realistically, it would be stupid for her to stop by and talk with my priest. Everyone knows that a priest is not going to tell a stranger something about one of his parishioners unless he has their permission. But apparently, there was someone out there who didn't know that. You think Liza's murder was a random act of violence? Yes. She was careless at times. Okay. Explain how she was careless. Well, sometimes we would go to help a girl in another state and Liza would make friends with strange men. She wasn't necessarily cheating on Carson, but she liked to flirt and get attention from other men. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Abigail Abernathy. She thought Liza was having an affair before she was murdered. Perhaps Madeline had been in on the affair, and that was why the lady behind the counter at Mickelson's had recognized Liza's picture. Did you and Liza spend time at Mickelson's? No. Liza always refused to go there, even if we were helping a girl in the area. I've been there many times but never with Liza. It was hard to tell if Madeline was being completely honest. It seemed like she was still hiding information, but I needed to find out more about why she had shown up on my doorstep. Why did you come here? I need help. Someone has been following me and leaving threatening notes. I don't know why this is happening now, but I think it has something to do with Demario Masters. Demario Masters is in prison and has been for years. Why do you suspect that he's after you? I took his child away. The one thing he always said was that I could go, but his daughter couldn't. I took his child, his family hated me for it. I think he has told them to find me. Madeline seemed to be delusional about Demario. No love lost, but Demario didn't seem to have enough venom to stalk and kill Madeline, and Alyssa Masters even seemed to have a slight affinity for her. What about one of the husbands or boyfriends of the women you've helped? Couldn't one of them be after you? It's possible, but I've been doing this for years, and nothing has happened. I'm very careful. Think about it. You thought we were in a cult or something like that? There isn't much evidence to connect me to the women. It was true, Madeline's operation was covert and impressive, but I still wasn't sure how this fit into Liza's demise. Ms. Price, how was Liza involved in all of this, and what do you think it has to do with her murder? Madeline sighed. That one situation, how we got her out, is something I regret. If I could just have those moments back, I would change so much. You think she was murdered because of her past? Yes. I nodded, before heading into the kitchen to boil another kettle of water. When I returned, I pulled my chair closer to Madeline. Start from the beginning. New Orleans, Louisiana, New Year's Eve, 1999. New Orleans sat in a thick cloud of haze. The causeway was packed with commuters and early partygoers enthralled by the Y2K storyline. What would happen when the clock struck 12? Would the world fall into mass chaos? Even though New Year's Day had come and gone without a hitch on the other side of the world, the partygoers allowed the lure of Y2K to heighten their passions. On New Year's Eve 1999, the Big Easy offered more sleaze than usual. Liza Abernathy was eagerly awaiting the massive shutdown of the city at midnight, but not because she wanted to party. Instead, Liza wanted the chaos of Bourbon Street at midnight because her life depended on it. Of course, to save herself, she would be sacrificing an innocent, and for that she was truly sorry, but what else could she do? You can't panic. The moment you get the chance, do it. After that, you run like hell to the corner of Canal and Bourbon. Canal and Bourbon Streets are where all the festivities start, so by that time the crowds will be moving toward Esplanade. We'll have the benefit of the crowd, and no one would pay attention to the alleys. We're armed, so we won't have to worry about the dopers and prostitutes. If we lock the doors and keep the guns handy, we'll be fine. Once you're in the van, you're safe. You hear that, Liza? Once you're in the van, you are safe, so just get to the van. If you don't make it to the van by 12:45 a.m., we're leaving. The black Ford Econoline van would be idling in the alley. They knew traffic would be terrible, but that was okay. As long as DeMario didn't see her get into the van, it didn't matter how long they were stuck in traffic or if they were able to get out of town that night. We'll camp a few days in Fontainebleau State Park. Hotels are easy, and all the information is traceable, but staying in a park will buy us time. On January 4th, we'll hit the highway and head back to Michigan, but you have to change your address to the safe house in the French Quarter before we leave. Got it? The team would head north, but leave a trail that led to the French Quarter. Liza Abernathy would be listed as living with Madeline Price in a small 2-bedroom apartment on Domain Street. If DeMario went looking for them, he'd search in Louisiana. Liza listened to the rapid-fire instructions with great trepidation. Clearly, Madeline had done this before, perhaps 1,000,000 times, but this was her maiden voyage. He's crazy, so we can't take any chances. There won't be any time for goodbyes or anything like that. In fact, I must insist that you don't tell anyone here or back at home what we're doing. Just run like hell. We will take care of the rest. Liza nodded. I need a firm commitment. My life could be on the line as well. I'm willing to take the risk if that means you will be free, but I have to know that you're ready to make the commitment. Madeline spoke and moved like a soldier. Her eyes were intent and focused, and her words clear and precise. Directions and actions were given without emotion. You want to go back to Michigan, which is fine, but you will need to stay at the safe house for 3 months before you let your family know you're safe and in town. I don't have much money saved. How will? You will stay at the safe house in Sheboygan for 3 months. During that time, DeMario will try to track you down. First, he'll find out you've rented a place here, which will be false. Next, he will look for you in Detroit and Livonia. He thinks you're weak and stupid, and that you only know to run back to your parents. What if he continues to look for me after 3 months? By the time he finds you, and he will, you will be in control of your life. You also will not be living in Detroit. That is another stipulation. If you want to deter him, live in the suburbs. If he shows up in Northville Township, Novi, Farmington Hills, etc., he'll have to be on his best behavior. He's black. The police will already be watching him, because they know he doesn't belong. Liza bristled at the insinuation that covert racism could save her life. Madeline noticed. In this case, the unfortunate stereotypes are protecting you. It is what it is. No need to feel one way or another about it. Besides, he's a monster. Do not feel sorry for him. Why aren't we leaving New Orleans immediately? If you're running, no one expects you to stay in the place you're running from. It also gives you time to understand the weight of what we're doing. DeMario will look for you around town, but not in a park. He's a city boy. He'll assume you're in the city. He'll contact any friends or family of yours he knows back in Michigan, and since they don't know anything and you've been estranged from them, they won't act. DeMario is an arrogant criminal. He's not going to walk into a police station and file a missing person report. Liza already knew the answer, but she decided it was worth asking anyway. Madeline, what about Danica? Is there no way we can get her? Maybe we can stop by and get her before heading back to Michigan. Madeline slammed her fist against the side of the van. We've been through this. You know the plan. Do not deviate from the plan. But she's my baby. I need to. DeMario Masters is lazy. He won't find work, and after a few months, he'll be back in Michigan. In a year, once you're on your feet, you find him, take him to court, and get your child back. That's the way it has to be. 14. Madeline recounted the story to me with a stoic face, but her eyes revealed the hidden emotions of pain and remorse. She wasn't looking for pity. She knew what she did was intentional and irreversible. What would you change about that situation? I asked. The lies. I wouldn't have told them. We could have gotten both of them out. I was younger then and stupid. After I left DeMario, I was angry. I blamed Liza for the end of my relationship with DeMario. Of course that was a godsend, but as a young woman I didn't see it like that. I wanted her to pay for what she'd done. Even though I was over DeMario, I wasn't over how she snuck in the back door and took what I considered to be mine. Why did she reach out to you? I don't know. I guess she knew I would understand. She had left her entire life behind. Her parents were distraught, but the best they could do was rent her a tiny frame house in Brightmoor. She kept running away, and they just wanted her safe. So they rented her a house, but they didn't have anything to do with her. She mailed the rent check and never saw them. They had no idea how bad things were. They didn't like how she was living, so they stayed away. I don't even think they knew she was in Louisiana. Why did you agree to help her? She needed help. And you knew how bad it was because you'd been with him. Madeline nodded. He was extremely violent, I knew that. Liza tracked me down because she wanted to know what I'd done to get out. All she wanted was to get out, and I forced her to leave her daughter. It was a blind jealousy. I didn't even know that was what it was back then. I would do anything now to change it. It wasn't the story I'd expected to hear, but it made sense. Everything is about love or money. This time, love, or at least a relationship that had been carried out under the guise of love, had spurred something nasty. Now, I just needed to find out if all of this figured into Liza's murder. What happened after Liza came back to Michigan? After we got Liza out, she was so grateful that she wanted to repay us by helping. That was great, because she could reach a certain demographic that didn't respond to me. Liza knew all the former cheerleader-turned-alcoholic abused wives who lived in the suburbs. I knew all the college girls who hid their pain in the silence of dorm rooms. Over the years, we've helped more than 60 women get out of abusive relationships. You mentioned Liza was careless with men. Why are you so sure she wasn't having an affair? She was more of a tease, just like the attention. We weren't best friends, but we had to be open about secrets because of what we were doing. I would have known if she was having an affair. What were you meeting about the day Liza was murdered? She wanted to talk to me about something, said there had been a development of some kind. We were always careful about what we said on the telephone. We didn't think our phones were tapped, but we'd learned the best way to transmit delicate information is in person. I had a feeling that Madeline knew exactly what Liza wanted to talk to her about. Even so, I held my tongue. She had given me more than enough information to research. Now, I just needed to find out who was upset about Liza and Madeline's underground network. How many people know what you're doing? Just those of us who work to get the girls out. Others know we help women, but they don't know the details. Tell me why you think someone is after you. Someone has been leaving notes and trailing me. Tonight, I was followed from the parking garage at the U to my house. Do you have the notes? Yes. Madeline pulled 2 half-sheets of loose-leaf paper from her jacket pocket. Both notes were scribbled in erratic, angry print. The letters appeared to have been carved into the paper with great force. The ink marks penetrated the faded blue lines. The first note said, "Live by the sword, die by the sword." The second note said, "Sins of the father." These are clichés, nothing personal. Someone feels like you've wronged them, but they don't know you well enough for personal attacks. As for a sword, who have you cut down? Are you thinking that this is some type of metaphor or symbolic message? That might be overthinking it a bit. Well, if someone simply wanted to scare you, the messages would be more ominous. These messages are meant to shame and remind you of something. Someone feels you participated in an injustice. I haven't wronged anyone. I considered pointing out the tale Madeline had just shared, but thought better of it. Instead, I said, "You may not have hurt anyone in your eyes. I'm not saying you did anything to deserve this, but perception is subjective. Someone out there feels like you did something to them." "That can't be it," Madeline said with finality. I needed Madeline out of my hair. She'd come to me for help, but engaging in a debate was futile. I needed time and the freedom to work. "Ms. Price, you have houses around the state. You need to go to one that is outside of this area. Stay there for a while. I'll send my assistant with you. Before we do that, do you think you were followed here?" "I don't think so. The car I think is following me is an old, reddish-brown Cutlass. It's probably a 1984 or 85 in great shape. I lost them by sneaking into the shed out back and riding my four-wheeler away from the house. There's another safe house about 2 miles from my place. I picked up my other car once I got there. An old Cutlass wouldn't stand out if it was in good shape. People love their cars in Michigan, and cherished classics are seen on a regular basis." "Okay. Well, I'm going to call my assistant and have him stay with you at one of your houses. Do you have anything outside of this area? Perhaps something on the other side of Detroit?" She nodded but didn't elaborate, which was fine. I didn't need to know at this point, and Martin would tell me later. I called Martin and asked him to come to my place as soon as possible. Martin and Madeline left for parts unknown, and I headed to my home office in the basement. The messages from the notes ran through my head. "Sins of the father, live by the sword, die by the sword." Someone was sending a message. It sounded like revenge, which gave some credibility to the idea that Demario Masters was involved, but he was in prison. The younger brother was living on borrowed time in Cass Corridor. One sister was caring for a bundle of kids, and the other sister lived across the country. Of course, there was also the chance that Madeline was simply trying to shift the focus. Her story was curious. It was understandable why she hadn't originally told me about her undercover efforts to help battered women, but due to the nature of her endeavors, the perpetrator could be anyone, an ex-husband, or even a battered woman who held Madeline responsible for her life after leaving the abusive relationship. But if either of those were true, what did it have to do with Liza Abernathy's death? Why did Liza want to meet with Madeline the day she died? Who was the person Liza had told Abigail Abernathy about? Madeline had said that Liza wasn't careful with men. According to Madeline, Liza liked attention but wasn't a cheater. The Masters had to be the missing link. Demario was locked up, but his 2 sisters, brother, daughter, and several nieces and nephews were out in the world. Perhaps someone was carrying out an order from Demario. It wouldn't have been the first time someone in prison had ordered a hit. It was late in Michigan, but the evening was just getting underway in California. I called Sarah Quick a second time. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Mrs. Quick, I need to find your niece Danica. Any information you have that will help me do that would be helpful." Sarah sighed and waited before speaking. "Mrs. Wilcox, I don't want to open a can of worms I can't close. I keep my distance for a reason. I understand, but I need to speak with Danica. Please, if there's anything you can do to help, I would appreciate it." A long, tense silence filled the phone. After a few minutes of nothing, I was getting ready to bid Sarah Quick goodbye when she said, "She's at Alyssa's house." I checked after we spoke. "Are you sure?" I asked, refraining from telling Sarah that I had just visited Alyssa's house, and there had been no mention of Danica being there. I thought back to the kids in the house. The boy on his cell phone, the toddler, the elementary school-aged kids from the basement, and the angry girl with the green eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Quick. You've been very helpful." I would stop by Alyssa's house early in the morning and wait for Danica to leave. She may or may not attend school, but it looked like Alyssa was at least trying to do the right thing for the kids. I decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she really was working hard to keep the kids on the straight and narrow. In the meantime, I would see what else I could find out about the Masters family. The Masters family didn't have a major web presence. DeMario's brother, Raymond, had a few social media accounts he hadn't used in several years. The posts he'd created were inarticulate and sparse. His face was thin and worn, showing the signs of his illness. The last address listed for Raymond Masters was in Cass Corridor, a section of Detroit where I had no desire to venture. I couldn't see a reason to talk with Raymond, but another visit to the prison might be in order. First, I would try to track down Danica. Why would Alyssa Masters lie about knowing where her niece lived? The obvious answer was to protect her, but I had no idea what she needed protection from. A murder conviction? A plethora of bad memories? I couldn't deduce what was going on from the interview with Alyssa. I needed another perspective. I needed to run all of this by someone. Martin was busy, so I called my old friend. Father Keegan had been my confidant for several decades. As a child, after my brother was abducted, my parents went into a permanent state of mourning. The inexplicable loss of a child and the constant search for answers made them aloof. It had been painful, but as I'd aged, I understood that irrevocable harm had been done to our family. When I'd been younger and bitter, Father Keegan had helped me to keep from becoming a terrible person. He was accustomed to my late-night phone calls and inquiries outside of his realm of expertise. It was a little after midnight when I gave him a call. "Father Keegan, can you talk?" "Hi, Sylvia. I'm at the hospital. Is everything okay?" "Yeah. I just wanted to talk, but it sounds like you're busy." The hustle and bustle of a hospital wing raged on in the background. He must have been anointing someone or administering the last rites. "I am not too busy. I'm all done for the night." Father Keegan was always very careful about what he told me. He considered his duties as a priest sacred and private. He could tell me who he'd seen in the hospital, but he had a knack for only revealing what was necessary. That was one reason he was such a great confidant. I knew that whatever I told him wouldn't find its way to anyone else. "Father Keegan, I'm having trouble pinpointing deception. That woman who came to see you was here tonight. Claims that someone is after her, but I don't know if she is just trying to throw me off the trail or if there really is someone after her. Meet me at Chauncey's in 20 minutes. I need a pint." Chauncey's is a dank little pub 2 blocks over from my house and 4 blocks from the church. I arrived at 12:45 a.m. and headed for a pair of stools at the end of the dimly lit bar. I had a pint of Guinness waiting when Father Keegan arrived. His wispy white hair crept out from underneath a black skullcap, and his brown eyes showed exhaustion. I felt bad for disturbing my elderly friend at such a late hour. "Father, I'm sorry for keeping you awake. I had to send Martin on a job and..." He waved off my apology and picked up his pint, holding it in midair, motioning for a toast. "I know how it is to be lonely, to be the person everyone turns to, not that I am having these issues. I'm just saying that I understand." Life had been lonely since Derek's death. Initially, I hadn't thought of my call to Father Keegan as a cry for help, but maybe it was in a way. I needed someone. "Thanks for understanding," I said, lifting my glass and clinking it against Father Keegan's. "So what has you stumped?" "I don't know if this woman is guilty or if she's trying to throw me off the scent. She was my #1 suspect, but now she is telling me that someone is after her. Perhaps it is the same killer, but why wait so long to strike?" "Well, maybe it's not so black and white. Maybe the woman is protecting something or someone. She might be afraid of what will happen if you find out the truth, but she may not have had anything to do with the murder itself. She's protecting someone because she thought they were justified. Something like a killing in the name of righting a wrong. Yes, killing is still wrong, but there's more to it. It's like the amount of culpability in a crime. Like sin. Yes, like sin. There are venial and mortal sins, but the severity of a mortal sin can be reduced by the circumstances of the situation. As in killing someone in self-defense. Exactly. It sounds like you remember that lesson. I definitely remember revisiting confession. You gave us fifth graders that handout with 1,000,000 pages. I never thought I'd read that thing, but I read it. It still sticks in my mind. I took a drink and reminisced about elementary school. My brother had been gone for only a few months at that time. I remember being so angry with him, so resentful and full of hate that I hadn't been able to miss him. It seemed like things were so easy back then, but nothing was or ever had been easy. Funny how our minds try to convince us that the past was better than it was. Sylvia, you aren't looking for deception. You could look for mercy, misguided mercy perhaps, but someone is looking out for another person who didn't deserve what happened to them. Or maybe you've got the wrong suspect. I thought of Madeline Price. She'd been cagey, but maybe she was hiding something other than that she was a murderer. Maybe she was protecting something or someone else. Yes, she and Liza had a shaky past, but they had clearly moved past all of that. Why wait so long to strike? The rationale didn't make sense. Misguided mercy, I repeated. Interesting. I guess my suspect could be protecting someone else, or I could just have the wrong suspect. I hadn't really looked at it from that angle. I don't know exactly what you're dealing with, but think of what the suspect cares about. What does the person hold dear? She's an activist of some kind. She's really doing good in the world, but she does it in a covert manner. Very few people know what she's doing. She doesn't want to be a hero. Well, that tells you that the opposite of the obvious is probably what's going on. Sounds like a puzzle, but I bet you'll figure it out. You've always been one smart cookie. Father Keegan turned his glass up and guzzled the last of the beer. I did the same, before tossing a $20 bill onto the bar. 15. The next morning I slept in a bit, waiting until after 5 a.m. to rise. After 2 cups of coffee, I ran my usual route, showered, and was dressed by 6:15. Whether Danica was attending school was debatable, but many of the folks in Brightmoor were underemployed, and sending kids out to school was often a reprieve from being surrounded by children. When I was a cop, we'd run into scores of teenagers roaming the streets during school hours, most likely taking part in petty drug deals. Parents in Brightmoor sent their children out into the world every morning, but school was not the landing place for many teens. Alyssa had a house full of children. Sending them to school would be her only relief. Young people were scattered throughout the neighborhood, even though it was early in the day. I made it to Brightmoor by 7 a.m. and parked down the street from Alyssa Masters' house. Some of the younger children emerged from the house and headed down the street. I stayed near the end of the street and watched the house for almost 2 hours before the teenage girl I'd seen the other day came out the front door. She was wearing baggy blue jeans that hung loose on her hips and a red and black flannel shirt. I knew what that meant, gang affiliation or a wannabe. Either way, it told me a bit about her mentality. Her thick, curly hair was pulled back into a bun and restrained under a red bandana. A tattered brown backpack hung from her shoulder, and her face was pushed close to a cell phone screen. I started the car and cruised down the street, following her at a steady speed. She appeared to be headed to Fenkell, probably to a bus stop. I considered stopping her, but decided it would be more interesting to find out where she was going. The girl stopped on Fenkell Avenue and waited at a bus stop that was shrouded in litter and early spring grass. The backpack hung from her left shoulder. She was intently focused on her cell phone, fingers moving swiftly across the screen. I waited at the corner of the street for 10 minutes and watched her get on the bus. I lagged under the speed limit, following 3 car lengths back, waiting to see if she got off the bus. Surprisingly, she seemed to be going to school. After the closure of Redford High, most Brightmoor students ended up at Cody High School, which required a somewhat lengthy bus ride. I drove ahead and took a chance, parking on a side street next to the school and waiting for the bus to arrive. As I heard the bus roaring down the street, I got out of the car and stood near the small shelter near the bus stop. "Danica," I said as the girl stepped off the bus. She turned and looked, her thick dark hair concealing the side of her face. As soon as my face registered, she took off running. She was in full flight, running north of the school into a neighborhood of burned-out houses, but the 45 strapped to my ankle provided some comfort. I hadn't expected to venture into a Detroit neighborhood. Proceed with caution, I reminded myself as I closed in on the girl. Her backpack and purse flapped against her back. She was fast, but after a block she slowed down, tripped, and fell to the ground. I grabbed hold of her backpack. Calm down. I just have a few questions, I said, holding on to the squirming teen. I ain't saying nothing. Listen, I'm going to let go of your backpack. Do not try to run, okay? I waited until she nodded her head in agreement. Danica Masters was short in stature, and her face had been weathered by years of living in uncertainty. Her body was swimming under her oversized clothes. Danica, I just want to solve a murder. A woman was murdered in cold blood, and I just want to know why. How would I know anything? I just want to question anyone who is connected to the deceased. I assume you know why I want to talk to you. Danica nodded, but didn't speak. She folded her arms and tried to look tough, but failed miserably. Underneath the thuggish exterior was a scared little girl. I'm here to ask some questions about your parents. She tried to look uninterested, but I saw a slight gleam of interest in her eyes. Do you know this woman? I slid a picture of Liza out of my pocket. Danica looked at the photo. There was no recognition in her eyes. She shook her head no. Next, I pulled out a picture of Madeline Price and showed it to her. Do you know this woman? Danica's eyes lit up. I don't know her, but I seen her around. Where? Brightmoor. She come around every now and then. Sometimes she go to that fish place, and she drive through every now and then. What else can you tell me about her? I stalled, feeling guilty about the next line of questioning. The poor girl didn't recognize a picture of her own mother. Wait. Danica raised her head and looked me in the eye for the first time. Was that my ma? Suddenly the rough-and-tumble street thug looked like a small child. I hesitated before responding. Yes. That was a picture of your mother. Can I see it again? I handed her the picture. Danica ran her fingers over the photo, as if she was trying to touch her mother. This wasn't quite what I had expected. A cloud of shame came over me, as I recognized I was putting her through the pain of reminiscing about the abandonment. Do you ever see your father? She looked up from the picture. Yeah. When we had a car, Auntie would drive me up there. Our car been in the shop, so we ain't been up in a while. But we right, me and my dad. So you know about your mother, correct? Yeah. Did you have any contact with your mother? No, but I know she sent money to whoever was taking care of me. It still come. A stipend for anyone who would care for Danica. Sad but interesting. It was also interesting that it was still being sent. Who was sending money? Carson? How long have you lived with your aunt? About a month. Foster parents got tired of me, sent me back. Why were you calling your aunt Mom? 'Cause she all the mama I ever known. What you think? Strange, she'd only been there for a month. Even so, I felt guilty for torturing Danica with questions. Okay, so you've seen the lady in the second photo. Can you tell me exactly where you've seen her, besides the fish place? Around. Usually Da Costa, Dolphin, those streets by the fish place. She must know people round there. I thought about Martin stashed away with Madeline. Was he safe? I wondered if I had set him up to protect a murderer. Okay. Make sure that you head to school. If you don't, I'll report you for truancy. An idle threat, but maybe she would think that it was a possibility and actually head to school. I let go of Danica's backpack and headed back to the car. Danica took off fast in the opposite direction. I considered following her, but decided that she was probably just skipping school. Not to mention, I had a bone to pick with Alyssa Masters. Why had she lied to me? Why agree to meet, but not tell me that Danica was living with her? I needed to check on Martin. The longer he was with Madeline, the more uneasy I felt. I called him when I got back into the car. "How are things going?" "Fine, but I'm not sure Madeline is in danger at this point. We're really off the beaten path." "Yeah, I was just thinking that. How far are you from the office?" "About 2 hours away." "There's been a development. Meet me at the office in 2.5. So, Demario and Liza's daughter is alive, and she lives with her aunt. This makes me think the husband should be added back to the suspect list," Martin said. "Why is that?" "Think about it. Liza is dead. Carson and his children inherit everything unless there is another child, one in need. She lives in Brightmoor, and they live in Northville Township. Someone's paying a stipend for Danica. Well, maybe it was rage. Maybe Carson killed Liza because he found out Liza had a secret life. What if Liza was sending money to the girl behind his back? What if he didn't know Danica existed until a few years ago, right before Liza was murdered? It was an interesting angle, but Carson didn't really need money, and a small stipend didn't seem like something he would flip out over. He had been wealthy long before he met Liza, and her death hadn't changed his financial situation. But what if he had found out that Liza had a child by another man? A secret child? What would his reaction have been? Money is one thing, but finding out that your wife had neglected to tell you she had an illegitimate child might be a bit much. Let's look at Carson again. I wonder if he knew about Danica. He could have been completely in the dark about her, but if he found out, I doubt he would like the fact that his wife lied to him. Does he seem violent? No. In fact, he is rather gentle with the children and the housekeeper. He seems to be a type of personality, but he's mild and he doesn't give off the vibe of a murderer. So what's our next move? Martin asked. There were avenues to explore, but just because there were secrets, I couldn't draw the conclusion that all secrets were related to the crime. Some people keep secrets to protect those they love. I knew that all too well. I'll interview Carson once more. You're coming with me this time. Watch for his reaction when I bring up Danica. I also need to talk with the Abernathys again. They have a granddaughter out there they might not know about, but if they know about her, I'm curious about why they didn't mention her. Alyssa Masters deserves another visit as well. She conveniently forgot to tell me that Danica lived with her, and the two pretended to be mother and daughter. What's the angle there? Alyssa could just be protecting Danica, but I don't know why. Is she protecting her because she's guilty of a crime? Or because she's a child who has already experienced so much pain? What are you hoping to learn from the Abernathys? The Abernathys' daughter was murdered, and I'm trying to find the murderer. I hope they will be inspired to share whatever they know with me. All information is pertinent until it isn't. They have a granddaughter who has been left on various doorsteps, and their daughter is dead. What is going on there? Did Demario get angry about this abandonment? Is Danica seething with hatred and resentment for being left to poverty-stricken relatives when her mother was living in the lap of luxury? Liza didn't just burn bridges, she set eternal fires. Right. She altered the lives of several people. The grudges could run deep. What do you want me to do with Madeline? I had almost forgotten about her. Have you talked with her much? Not really. She seems nervous and cagey. If Carson didn't kill his wife, this Madeline lady did. She's so odd. Being odd doesn't mean she's a killer. Go back and spend a couple more hours with her. Talk to her about Liza and see how she reacts. I'm heading to the Abernathys first, and Alyssa's after that. We'll touch base this evening. I arrived at the Abernathys' house around noon. Once again, Mrs. Abernathy pulled the front door open before I could knock. She was dressed in pale blue capri pants and a flower print tunic. Her hair was swept up into a hair clip. A few shining blonde strands fell freely over the seashell adornment at the back of her head. Mrs. Wilcox, how can I help you? Mrs. Abernathy, there have been some developments. Would you mind if I ask you a few more questions? I remembered the emotional outburst that had taken place the last time we talked. My heart was beating in my throat, but I kept my voice soft and calm, as if it didn't matter if she agreed to talk with me. I watched her eyes go from suspicious to curious and sad. No matter how crazy she was, the motherly instinct, the need to know what had happened to her daughter, caused her creased brow to smooth out and her head to tilt. "I don't have much time, but you can come in," Mrs. Abernathy said, stepping back and allowing me to enter the house. The information I had to share wouldn't be pleasant. I knew it was a risk, but I had to resurrect the past if I hoped to solve the case. "Would you like tea?" "No, thank you, Mrs. Abernathy. I'm going to get my husband. If you have news about Liza, he'll want to hear it." I followed her into the living room, took a seat, and waited. Mrs. Abernathy headed upstairs, and after what sounded like a muffled argument, the couple emerged. Mr. Abernathy's hair was ruffled and his eyes were red. It looked like he had been taking a nap. "Mrs. Wilcox, my wife says you have information about Liza. If that's true, I think we should fire all the police in Detroit and have you solve the city's cold cases," Mr. Abernathy said in a sarcastic but jovial voice. "Well, I have some information. First, I'm wondering if you knew Liza had a child while living in Brightmoor. Since she was living in a house you owned, I assume you know about Danica." Mrs. Abernathy stood up and left the room. Mr. Abernathy watched her leave but said nothing. "I've learned that you own houses in Brightmoor. You rented a house to Liza and Demario Masters, correct?" My question was greeted with silence and a blank look. "Mr. Abernathy, I'm not here to judge you or your family. I just need to know what happened when Liza was living in Brightmoor. Now this may come as a shock, but I think that Madeline Price might have something to do with your daughter's murder. When she was a teen, Liza ran away and did what she wanted. We were disturbed by it, but we didn't want her in the system. We let it ride itself out. You thought setting her up in a house of her own was best? We rented a house to Liza because we wanted her to be safe. You must understand. She was a disappointment at the time, but we never abandoned her. We didn't want to condone her behavior, but we wanted her safe. Over the years, we've made a habit of renting those places to young single mothers, but Liza was an exception. It was just her and that man, but we thought, well, why not? At least we know where she is." "Did you visit her?" "Never. We told her to come home when she was ready. We would not accept her lifestyle, but we loved her. Mrs. Wilcox, you have to believe that we loved her." "Did you know about Danica?" He waited, parted his lips but didn't speak. "Did you know about Danica?" I repeated. "We told her to have an abortion. We assumed she'd done that, but eventually we found out that she'd had the child and left it with the Masters. It sounds callous, but we thought it was for the best. After all, we didn't know much about those types of children, so we thought it was best that the girl be with her people." Disgusted by his inability to recognize that Danica was one of his people, I moved on to Madeline. "You rented to Madeline Price. Tell me how she fits into all of this." Madeline was a good girl, one of my business associate's daughters. Great grades, stable home. Somehow, she got mixed up with this Demario Masters character. Within a few months, she was pregnant. Her parents were outraged and wanted nothing to do with her after that. We'd met Madeline a few times and had tried to forge a bond between the girls because we were looking for good influences for Liza. It was a total shock when Madeline got pregnant. The two didn't get along well, but after Liza went to visit Madeline a few times, the girls seemed to have a friendship. Then the truth came out. It was Madeline's boyfriend who had caught Liza's attention. These women had a history of familiarity, but not necessarily friendship. How deep did the deception run? Liza ended up starting a thing with Madeline's boyfriend? Yes. She started running away, skipping school, and not listening to a thing we said. We had no idea what to do with her. Eventually, we compromised. We set her up with a house in Brightmoor because that was where she wanted to be. How did Madeline feel about Liza taking her boyfriend? Obviously, there was trouble between the two girls. Madeline was angry, but she got over it real fast. Within a year of leaving that guy alone, she had graduated and was doing well. Eventually, she ended up getting an internship at my company, and kind of became like our surrogate daughter. During that time, sadly, we lost touch with Liza. She always mailed the rent check, so we never had to go over to collect. It's sad and shameful, but we just couldn't stand what she was doing. Rivals. Liza and Madeline had not only competed for DeMario, they had also vied for the Abernathy's affection. The prodigal daughter hadn't been accepted back into the fold as easily as she'd been expelled. If a friend took my place in my family, we would no longer be friends, I thought to myself. Madeline Price was the person Liza was going to meet when she was murdered. What do you think about that? Surely doubts about Madeline's alibi must have come up. She's the last person to speak to your daughter, the person that first noticed she was missing, and the person Liza was going to meet. Mr. Abernathy was quiet while he ran the information through his head. Mrs. Wilcox, I can't think of Madeline in those terms. Why is that? Because it would be like losing another daughter. That made sense, but I needed to know what he really thought about all the coincidences involving Madeline. Mr. Abernathy, Madeline Price is connected to your daughter's last moment on this planet. I need you to think about what that really means. Realistically, she has to be the number one suspect. I have thought about it at times. It is strange that Madeline is connected to Liza's last hours of life, but I don't believe that she killed my daughter. Think about it, Liza stole her boyfriend years ago, but Liza goes on to marry a rich man. She doesn't get stuck with single motherhood because she abandons her kid, and Madeline ends up raising a kid by herself. Madeline doesn't get a Prince Charming. Imagine how the resentment festered. There were all those years of pretending to be friends when in reality, neither of them was thrilled to be connected. Mr. Abernathy folded his hands in front of his face. He appeared to be considering that Madeline Price could be someone other than who he thought she was. It does seem odd, but if you knew Madeline the way we do, you would understand that she couldn't have done this. She's such a special soul. I tried to imagine what had given Mr. Abernathy this impression of Madeline. There had to be a missing piece to the puzzle. I could admit that she had the yoga culture running through her veins, but it was clear she had been something other than that to them at one point. If the Abernathys had rented a house to her, they knew about her past. Why wouldn't they take that into account? Mr. Abernathy, Liza and Madeline had a fight over DeMario Masters. It's something that the neighbors remember. Their rivalry wasn't just a silly schoolgirl thing. Mrs. Wilcox, I think we're just about done here. If you want to waste your time pursuing this avenue, feel free, but I don't have anything to add to your suspicions. We love Maddie, and she was good for Liza. I let go of that angle. What can you tell me about Liza and Carson? I think we've told you everything we know about that situation. Why were they together? Well, I guess there must have been a love between them. Mr. Abernathy, this is your baby girl. She's dead gone. And someone stole her from you. Just tell me why they were together. A surgeon marries a girl who isn't getting along too well in life. How did that happen? The words must have stung. Mr. Abernathy shook his head. A somber look came over his face before he said, they'd always had a thing for one another. We knew the Starks from business deals in the past. Over time we became friends, our kids played together. Peter never liked Carson, but Carson and Liza always had a bond. The Starks didn't want them together. Neither did we, but they ended up together. Now it made sense. The connection had been cemented in childhood, much like myself and Derek. The childhood memories, those moments in life when you are free to be yourself, a young, fresh, innocent person, had been at the root of Liza and Carson's love. It was poetic and bittersweet. Carson Stark, type of personality, superstar surgeon and rich guy, never forgot his first love. So they were friends as children? Yes. They played together as children. For a while they were best friends. Then, around the time Liza was 7, we cut off contact. Why? Liza wasn't the type of girl Carson was supposed to marry. I kept my composure as I listened to Liza and Carson's love story. Why is this such a big secret? Why not tell me you've always known Carson? His father and I had some unpleasant experiences. A lot of money was involved, and we had a falling out. We haven't spoken since then, even after Liza and Carson were married. Is there anything else you can think of that might help the investigation? No, but I want you to understand something. We loved Liza so much. Mistakes were made, but we loved her. One more question. Okay. Are you supplementing Danica's caretakers? What? Someone is sending money to Danica's aunt. Is it you? No. Like I said, mistakes were made, but we wouldn't do something stupid like that. There'd be no way to know that the money was being used for the girl. Thanks for your time, Mr. Abernathy, I said, standing up and shaking his hand. Once again, I let myself out. 16. The Abernathys had frustrated me with their need to keep up appearances. As I pulled out of the driveway, I reviewed other leads. Now I had another avenue to consider. There was much more to Liza and Carson's story. Why hadn't Carson told me they'd been childhood friends? I would contact him and schedule a meeting, but before I did that, I wanted to head back to the office and give myself time to digest the information. Martin was in the office when I got back, searching for information about the Abernathys. Hey. How'd things go? Martin, you will not believe what I found out, but before we get into that, let's put our suspects on the board. What about the Abernathys? Anything important come from them? Yes. What? Madeline and Liza were always competing, so much so that the Abernathys aren't willing to consider that Madeline could be involved in the murder because she's like a daughter to them, possibly the favorite daughter. Also, Carson and Liza were childhood sweethearts, but the Abernathys cut off contact between them when they were young. What? Why didn't Carson tell you he and Liza were childhood sweethearts? That's kind of weird. Right, so I think there is something we've missed. Let's go through it together. I clicked a few buttons on my computer, sending a file of pictures of our potential suspects to the printer. Martin grabbed the pictures as the machine spit them out and started taping them to the whiteboard. First, we have Madeline Price, I said. Yoga instructor, last person to talk with Liza, frenemy. Who's next? Carson? No. Danica. You want the kid on the suspect list? Danica had seemed sweet and soft when I trailed her that day, but that didn't mean she couldn't have killed her mother, especially considering that her mom had abandoned her to a life of poverty, while Liza and her half-siblings lived in luxury. Also, she was in Brightmoor. That meant she probably knew gang members and would have had access to opportunities to join. Yes? Think about it. You know what Carson's neighborhood is like, and you know what Brightmoor looks like. Imagine being left with a child-molesting felon and seeing that your mother had moved and had a new family. Good point. I guess she's a viable suspect. It would just be sad if she's the one who pulled the trigger. Still, she has to be on there. Martin added Danica to the suspect board. Madeline is the number 1 suspect, but Danica is a close number 2. Any others? Sure. Carson Stark, husband, doctor, wealthy, seemed to love his wife but was not aware of wife's past, remembers the little girl he knew before she took a stroll down Thug Lane. But Carson could have found out some of this stuff about Liza and reacted very strongly. Are the Abernathys Danica's benefactors? Mr. Abernathy claims they aren't. Do you think Carson loved Liza? I get the sense that he loved her, but Liza's past is rather surprising. Carson has a good reputation to protect. Finding out that Liza had been a single mom who had gone slumming in Detroit would have been shocking. It could have been too much. Do you think he is the benefactor? Possibly, but he might also be angry about the whole situation. We'll keep him up there. Next, we have Peter Abernathy. Liza's bitter brother is the only other heir to the Abernathy money, and he seems to despise his sister. He was softer when I talked with him and Abigail, but the first meeting left a bad taste in my mouth. Also, money is a motivator for many crimes. We don't know how much money, but we know they're into real estate, so probably a decent amount. But the parents are in good health, right? Martin asked. Yes, but Liza wasn't in the will until she rejoined the family. Why wait to kill Liza? I don't know, but we need to leave him on the list. Martin picked up the blank piece of paper. What's this for? The mystery Brightmoor boyfriend. What do we know about him? Well, lives in Brightmoor, so he's poor. Let's also assume he's black because 90% of the population in that area is, and let's say he is a drug dealer. That's a lot of speculation, Martin said. Sure, but he's my suspect to create, I said, winking at him. Any other suspects? I tried to think of any other people to add to the list. I don't think so. What about a random killer? Random killers are always a possibility, but I don't think so. Why not? Because someone killed Liza in Brightmoor. Something was pulling her to that place, and whoever shot her made it personal. Also, the perpetrator didn't rob her. They left behind her diamond ring, money, purse, and truck. What do you think about the ex-con guy she lived with? He could have had a minion kill her, but it would be odd because of the time lapse. That's the only thing about that scenario, it doesn't make sense. Okay, then we really only have 3 good suspects and only 2 are really viable, right? I sighed and shook my head. As uncomfortable as Peter had made me feel during the first meeting, he didn't feel like a good suspect. Let's fill out the reports for the suspects, file them, and go home. Also, I think you can tell Madeline it's okay to go home. I don't think she's really in any danger. We've had enough for today. We copied the information from the whiteboard into files for each, put them away, and closed up shop. I told Martin to meet me at the office at 9 a.m. the next day, and headed home. The house was too quiet and still that night. I put on Vivaldi's Winter, found some kale, spinach, and garlic in the refrigerator, and began chopping the trio. Once everything was chopped, I tossed it in the blender, added basil, parmesan, and olive oil, and blended the combination. Eventually, I sat down with a bowl of fettuccine with pesto for dinner. As I forked savory green-coated pasta into my mouth, I considered who would be the most viable suspect. Madeline had been the best lead, but the more I thought about it, the more I liked the idea of the Masters family being behind Liza's murder. Carson Stark would call for an update soon. I would confront him about not telling me he and Liza knew one another as children. That would shift the focus of our conversation. I finished my pasta and headed for my home office. I was piecing together a timeline of Liza's life when the phone rang. I stuck another clue on the whiteboard before answering. Hello? You're not looking in the right places. A dry, scratchy voice croaked into the phone. Hello? Who is this? You're looking for something that isn't there. A generation that didn't care went and followed the ultimate dare. You won't find tracks to trust, but building a case is a must. The past holds the clues that lead to the truth. The voice was raspy, scratching my eardrums. A chill ran down my spine. It was close to midnight, and my eyes burned with exhaustion. I stumbled around the office, searching for a pen and paper. A pen pierced the palm of my hand, but I shook off the pain as I struggled to find a slip of paper to write on. I ripped a piece of paper out of a notebook and began writing what I had heard. The past holds the clues that lead to the truth. What else do you want to tell me? I muttered into the phone, to keep the person on the other end talking. The voice was carefully crafted to sound male, but I could hear a hint of femininity behind the riddle. I jotted down the strange message. Yes. A generation that didn't care went and followed the ultimate dare. A generation that didn't care, was this a reference to Liza? She hadn't cared about her family's past. The fact was that they were well off, white, and not interested in mingling with people outside of their immediate social sphere. "Who is this?" I asked in vain. "A friend who cared, but couldn't stay there to see her die inside." The voice was creepy, and the phone call was just plain annoying. If this person knows who killed Liza, why not just reveal the truth for goodness sake? I repeated the words as I wrote them down. A friend who cared? Who did the friend care about? Liza Abernathy? No, the voice snapped harsh and cold. Madeline Price? No. Another snap. Then who? I asked. No response. I'm listening. What do you want to tell me? I asked. The phone disconnected. I tried to remember the voice. Had I heard it before? The riddles were like the messages Madeline had received. I didn't think I'd heard the voice before, but because it was disguised, I couldn't be sure. What did the riddle mean? I racked my brain for the next hour, trying to figure out what the caller wanted and who they were. Eventually, I had to admit that I didn't know who the caller was. I went to bed and suffered through a night of restless sleep. I'm looking for Mrs. Sylvia Wilcox. The phone had rung 7 times before I picked up. My brain was searching for clarity as I held the phone to my ear. Hello? Is this Mrs. Sylvia Wilcox? The voice was high-pitched but masculine, and the caller had a slight lisp. Yes, this is Sylvia Wilcox. Silence. Are you there? I asked. My name is Raymond Masters, and I need to see you. Raymond Masters was DeMario's younger brother. I was stunned. Glancing at my cell phone, I saw it was 6:30 a.m. I had overslept. Mr. Masters, I would be happy to meet with you. Tell me when and where. I can meet you at your office in an hour. Okay. I'll be there in an hour, he said, hanging up. No need for the address. I jumped out of bed. My heart was racing. Perhaps the prison hit had some validity. Maybe DeMario Masters had set up Liza and had her killed by one of the gang members on the outside. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee, I rushed to the office. I wasn't sure how Raymond had found me or why he had called, but I was eager to hear what he had to say. He arrived within the hour. I was standing at the door when he rang the bell. Hello, Mr. Masters. Thank you for coming, I said, opening the door and holding out my hand. A small, emaciated man wrapped his skeletal fingers around my hand and gave a weak squeeze. His face was aged beyond its years, but there were hints of how handsome he'd been. His eyebrows had been plucked and shaped, and a heavy layer of foundation was covering the cracks and wrinkles on his face. I had to come, Raymond Masters said, stepping through the door with a feminine sway. Okay. I'm ready to hear whatever you have to say. I led him to the comfortable chairs by the desk and motioned for him to sit down. I know what happened, Raymond blurted out as soon as he sat down. Great. Tell me. First, you gotta understand that my brother is crazy. He was abused as a child, and he abused me and his daughter and probably others. What type of abuse are we talking about? Raymond's eyes shifted to the floor. I nodded my head to show that I understood. I am sorry you had to go through that. Did you know Liza Abernathy or Madeline Price? Both. Liza was okay, just not too smart. Madeline was smart and nice. I always felt sorry for her. We tried to warn Madeline about DeMario. She just didn't listen. Before she could get away from him, she was pregnant. Her parents were married, and I think she was young enough to think that she was going to marry DeMario. Danica was tortured by my brother. She spent time in treatment centers, and when she found out that her mother was living the high life, she just exploded. At first, she wanted to get to know her and the other children, but Liza didn't want that. She was okay with meeting Danica, but she wanted her to be a dirty little secret. That explained why Liza had been in Brightmoor. It was the only place she would meet with Danica because no one she knew would be there. I couldn't imagine Danica as the killer, but the more I heard about how Liza had treated her, the more I felt like Danica was a likely suspect. Are you telling me that Danica killed Liza? Raymond looked down at his hands. Yes. Did she tell you she killed Liza? I know she did this and she's not done. That's why I'm here. What do you mean she's not done? Liza abandoned Danica, but not all by herself. Madeline encouraged her. I tried to be a friend to both. A friend? The soft, scratchy voice from the phone call the night before had mentioned being a friend. Raymond Masters had been the prank caller. You think Danica is going to hurt Madeline? There was logic to that assumption. Liza may not have abandoned Danica if she hadn't been encouraged. Then again, if the situation was desperate, which it seemed to be, it was hard to judge Liza. I think you need to find her. The tricky thing about being a PI is that you can't make an arrest. You investigate, and if you have solid evidence, you head to the police station. After you share your information with the officers, they decided whether you've done your job. The next step is the prosecutor's office. By that time, your suspects may have skipped town. If Danica was Liza's killer, I had to be careful about how I approached her before I took the information to the police. Mr. Masters, I am a private detective. I can't do anything with this information until I have something definitive to take to the police. Why did you come to me instead of going to the police? He pondered the question for a few minutes, then reached a skeletal hand up to his temple. The interview was clearly draining his strength. Mrs. Wilcox, I used to live the same life that my brother and sisters did. I ran credit card scams, smoked dope, and prostituted myself. There was a time when I thought I was doing all of that because I liked it. Danica is 17 years younger than I am. I've watched her grow up in the same dysfunctional way that I did. And I know that if she could do something different, she would, but it's all she knows, and the police don't always get that. I think you get that. It was strange. What had Raymond Masters heard about me? If she killed Liza, I want to see her do time for it. You understand that, right? Yes, and I agree. That's the right thing. Mrs. Wilcox, the doctors, told me I don't have long. I waited until it was too late to go to the doctor and get started on the treatments. By the time I got tested, the HIV had turned into AIDS. Now it won't turn back. Before I die, I want to see as many of my nieces and nephews in as safe a place as possible. Alyssa's mind ain't right, so she can't give them kids what they need, a chance. Danica needs to be away from all of that. If she gets locked up, she might get help, maybe even a high school diploma and college degree. If she stays on the streets, she gonna end up like the rest of us. I wondered why he thought Alyssa's mind was not right. She was going to school to be a nurse, and she was providing the best she could for her family. She was clearly one of the more stable members of the Masters clan, but there was no use telling that to her brother. That makes sense, but I can't protect her from what the police might do. The best thing would be for her to turn herself in. Yeah, but DeMario is her father, and she knows he would never want her to do that. She gonna run until you catch her. It's gotta be you to catch her. Why me? Because you'll hesitate to shoot. You a PI, so you gonna try to do things a different way because you have to. Raymond Masters knew how it worked. I was a citizen who owned guns, but the rights of law enforcement didn't apply to me anymore. He was in my office telling me what his niece had done, because I couldn't shoot her unless it was absolutely necessary. Smart. Do you know where Danica is now? Raymond's eyes filled with tears. He dropped his face into his hands and sobbed. I tried to stop her. I tried, but she wouldn't listen. Said she had to finish it, said they deserved it. What are you talking about? Mr. Masters, what did you try to stop her from doing? She got a car and some people from the hood. Went out to Ann Arbor late last night. I didn't need to hear anything else. Danica had gone to Madeline's. I hoped I wasn't too late. Mr. Masters, I have to ask you to leave, I said before typing out a text message to Martin and Charles. Meet me in Brightmoor ASAP. Please don't hurt her. She's just a kid and she's been through so much, Raymond begged as I ushered him out of the office. I will do what I can, but no promises. I thought about the additional charges Danica was racking up. If she had taken Madeline from her home, she would have a kidnapping charge and, God forbid, an additional murder charge. She would be tried as an adult, and her life would essentially be over. Of course, that wasn't unfair if she had taken the lives of 2 women. I locked up and rushed down the stairs. Charles called me back as I burst through the double doors and sprinted to the crosswalk. What's up, Sylvia? I need you. I think I've got a potential kidnapping on my hands. Where? It's in your precinct. Brightmoor. That's why I contacted you. Okay. Tell me what happened. Liza Stark's daughter killed Liza, and she's out to get revenge on the woman who encouraged her mother to abandon her. It's a long story, but I think we've got something here. We need to get to Brightmoor ASAP. Slow down. First, call the lady you think has been kidnapped. See if you can reach her. Yes, you're right. Okay, calling now, I said just as the light changed and I charged across the street. The moment I reached the other side, I pulled up Madeline's number and called. She answered on the second ring. Hello? Madeline? Yes? Who is this? Sylvia Wilcox. Are you still at the safe house? Yes. Why? Have you heard from Danica Masters? Silence on the other end. Madeline, this is important. Have you heard from her? No. Why would I hear from her? Madeline was safe. What if Raymond Masters had just told me a bunch of lies? Okay. Well, just call me back if anything out of the ordinary happens, okay? Sure. I will do that. Thanks for checking on me. I slowed my pace and called Charles back. False alarm. I may have been played. Madeline Price is at home and hasn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. Damn it, Charles, my eyes are crossing on this thing. I need help. Okay, relax. I'm free this afternoon. Meet me at Mickelson's. 17. Mickelson's was sparsely populated. The lunch rush consisted of a group of seniors at a back table, chatting and laughing away the afternoon. The same girl I'd spoken to weeks before was working the counter. She took a second look at me when I walked in. There was recognition, but no desire to reminisce. I took a seat at one of the wooden two-tops and waited for Charles. He arrived about 10 minutes later. Charles looked exhausted and ruffled around the edges. His maroon tie was crooked, and his gray suit coat hung unevenly on his oversized arms. Long night? I asked. Yeah. Things are kind of crazy at my place. My brother and his family surprised me with a visit. They're all staying at my place. Kids are great, but I'm glad I don't have them. Yet, I said. Don't jinx me. Charles said, swinging his arm for a handshake. We sat and waited for the lady at the counter to come over and take our order. 2 famous fish and chips, water for me, and a Coke for Charles. After the order was taken, we got down to business. Okay. Tell me what I need to know. The uncle says that the kid did it. Do you believe him? She has a good motive, knows the area well, and who else would Liza go to Brightmoor to meet? The bosses didn't want us doing too much with this case, because of the people involved. The Starks are like royalty, and the Abernathys are important too. They didn't want to be investigated, but if we'd known about the kid. The kid is a good angle, but she also had a motive to not kill Liza. Yeah? Like what? Someone sends money to whoever is caring for her. I'm guessing that someone was Liza. Now that she's gone, the money might keep coming, but there is a chance it will stop. I don't know how much, but life is hard for a kid in Brightmoor. Every dime helps. So the question is whether or not she was angry enough to not care about the money. That's one question, the other major question being, why did the uncle come to me? Why give me this information on his niece? Is it a setup? It was strange that the police had not discovered that Liza had a child, but I knew how politics could shape an investigation. Outside forces can really mess up an investigation. Don't think of it as a failure. Now we have something to go on. I just need your help bringing this kid in. Okay, but we need evidence before I can step in. The chief doesn't want us working anything that doesn't add up. Yeah, I think. My phone began to vibrate on the table. Hello? Kara is missing. It was Madeline Price, sounding frantic. Slow down. Start from the beginning. The school called. Kara hasn't made it to any of her classes today. She's missing. I think someone has her. Okay. Calm down. Where are you? On my way home. I have to find her. I'm headed to your place, but I'm in Detroit, so it'll take a while for me to get there. I hung up and filled Charles in on what was happening. Let's get lunch packed up, Charles said, catching my wrist as I stood to leave. He headed to the counter and explained that we had to leave. Our food was delivered in white paper bags with grease stains on the bottom. Call me after you talk to her. Will do, I said before getting into the Taurus and heading for I-96. I drove 5 over the speed limit and arrived at Madeline's place 35 minutes after leaving Mickelson's. I checked the property, making sure it was secure and free of intruders. Madeline showed up about 45 minutes later. Mrs. Wilcox, I don't know where to look. Kara is such a good girl. She would never skip school. I just know someone has her. Okay. When was the last time you spoke to Kara? Last night. We talk every evening between 6 and 7. Anything seem off? Did she say anything out of the ordinary? Madeline stared at the floor for a few minutes before looking up. Come into my office. We headed to Madeline's office and sat down. She opened her desk drawer and pulled out a notepad. Obviously, I am always trying to make sure that my child doesn't end up like I did. Last night everything was fine, but last week Kara said something that caused me to wonder. Madeline pushed the notepad across the table. She had scrawled the spot on the notepad along with "What does it mean?" Kara let it slip that she'd met a new friend. She wouldn't tell me where she met her, but they both enjoyed playing virtual reality games. She mentioned that there was a new club for teens called The Spot, and her new friend had invited her. I tried looking it up, but couldn't find anything. I know Kara's friends, so it struck me as strange. I asked more questions, but she buttoned up about things. Back when I was a cop, there was a place the kids in Brightmoor called The Spot. It was an old factory that had fallen into blight. The building was on the list for demolition, but the city had been slow about tearing it down. I hadn't been there for years, but it was probably still standing. Is there anything else you can tell me? Anything else that stood out? No. That was it. Okay. I have an idea. I'll be in touch. I pushed the notepad back across the table and headed for the door. Mrs. Wilcox? Where are you going? What are you going to do? Just stay here. Lock the door and keep the phone close, I said, closing the door behind me. I called Martin. Hey, what's the next move? I'm headed to Brightmoor. I'm going to text an address to you and Charles. Get there, but don't engage until I call back. Okay. I've got a hunch. The Spot is a small structure that served as a store, cafe, and pawn shop in the years after the packing factory had ceased production. It sat on the edge of Rouge Park, not far from the Coney Island where I'd met Don, the informant. When I was a cop, it was an unofficial lover's lane during the day, and a haven for rape and drug use at night. The bright street lamps of Rouge Park gave the Spot enough light for criminality without forcing assailants to provide additional illumination. I drove to a parking lot in the park, adjacent from the street where the old rundown building sat. I strapped one gun to my ankle and double-checked for the side-mounted Luger. Rouge Park was not a common destination for non-criminals, and the empty parking lot made the Spot the perfect place for a crime. I crept along the edge of the aluminum guardrail, that separated the park from the former neighborhood. After climbing over the guardrail, I fought through overgrowth and litter, hoping that the crunch of leaves and greenery wasn't as loud as it sounded to me. Inching up against the side of the building, I made sure that I wasn't visible to anyone inside it. I placed my back against the mangled aluminum siding and listened. At first there was nothing, but then I heard the faint sound of a voice. I turned to face the empty windowsill and saw Danica Masters holding a small pistol and standing in front of a young woman who was tied to a chair, Kara Price. "So you're my sister?" Danica asked as she strolled over to Kara. "Did you know that your mom told my mom to abandon me? Not that I blame your mom because my mother should have had more of a brain, but that's neither here nor there. My father has told me about your mom, how she was so smart. How she fooled him into thinking that she and Liza were bitter enemies, when they were actually running a business together." Kara looked up, confused. "Oh yes. You didn't know?" "Yeah, our moms helped women leave their husbands and boyfriends and start new lives. It's quite a thing. They have traveled all over the country together. Your mom is the real brains behind it, but my mother was the financial support. Surely your mom told you all of this?" "No? Well, there's more. Our dad wanted to see you and develop a relationship, but your mom prevented it. She didn't want you to associate with me or our father. He's languishing in jail, wondering how his eldest daughter is doing. Don't worry, I filled him in, but don't you think it's a shame that a man has to wonder how his child is doing, simply because her mother is a stupid, selfish bitch? Or maybe she's just smart," Kara said. Danica reached out and smacked Kara across the face, raging into a fit. I took this opportunity to slither through a gaping hole in the wall and scoot quickly behind a stack of cardboard boxes. The strong stench of excrement hit my nose, forcing me to hold back from gagging. The cardboard prevented me from seeing much, but I couldn't risk peering out over the top of the stack. I looked skyward, asking for strength, before gently lowering myself onto the filthy floor. "I see you just a stupid bitch too," Danica continued, berating her half-sister. I scanned the room for my next move. There was a beige couch, minus the cushions, opposite the mound of cardboard. If I could get there, I could surprise Danica from behind. I'd just have to wait until she got irate again. In my experience, when criminals were engaged in torturing or ranting at a victim, they miss things. Danica slapped her sister again and pushed her face close to Kara's. While she was screaming, I quickly dug my phone out of my pocket and sent a text message to Charles, the spot. Hostage situation. I stayed behind the cardboard, listening and waiting for the right moment to take Danica by surprise. At that point, I had to assume she was a cold and calculating murderer, and her behavior seemed to be escalating. There wasn't time to move to the couch. I would have to act quickly and be ready to shoot. Danica wouldn't have any trouble taking out both me and Kara. Your mother was so jealous. A spinster single mother living a lonely life. She resented my mother. Now there are 3 kids without a mother. Your mother couldn't stand it, so she took my mother's life. She knew no one would hear a thing. Brightmoor is a ghost town in these parts. We barely have any cops around here anymore. I eased around the side of the mound of cardboard, catching Kara's eye and holding my index finger against my lips. Your mother was weak, but she wasn't a bad person, I said. What? Danica spun around, pointing her gun in my direction. Your mother was weak, but you're more like her than you think. What? How so? I had Danica's full attention now. She was just trying to get the best possible outcome for herself, and you're trying to do the same thing. You're hurt, so you are seeking revenge because you think that will make your life easier. Your mother abandoned you because she thought it would make her life easier. You're both wrong. What you're doing is going to make your life worse, and you won't ever be able to fix it. Your mother did the same thing. That's why she was willing to meet with you. Abandoning you left a hole in her life that was unfixable. She thought the pain would go away, just like you think killing Kara, your sister, will make the pain go away. So you see, you and Liza have a lot in common. Lack of insight, wouldn't you say? Danica was angry but stunned. She stood still, staring at me, while her shoulders began to rise and fall heavily. I saw Kara quietly wriggling out of the ropes. I moved closer to Danica, my gun trained on her forehead. You think you know it all, don't you? You don't know shit about me or my mother. I know that your mother fought for you. She wanted custody, but she was too afraid of what her parents would say. They were bankrolling her life, but she would have taken you back. She never wanted to leave you, but your dad was so abusive she just couldn't stay. A child, no matter how injured or spurned they feel, always wants to know the story behind why their parents abandoned them. I watched Danica's eyes fill with hate before she turned and rushed back to Kara. Sprinting towards her, I caught her ponytail and stomped on her left calf before sticking my gun in the back of her skull. I don't want to, but you know I know how to use this, I said. DPD will be here in a few minutes. You okay, kiddo? I called to Kara. I heard Kara's violent crying, but I didn't dare take my eyes off Danica. Sirens screamed in the distance. 18. Solving a case always gives your ego a boost. A sense of satisfaction and calm wells up in your soul, and you remember why you do what you do. But that day, I didn't feel a sense of satisfaction. Instead, I felt a lump in my throat. Was it possible that Danica Masters had murdered her mom? I remembered the things she had been telling Kara before I interrupted. She thought Madeline had killed her mother. The cops thought Danica had killed Liza, but in my mind something was off. She's been talking, but we don't have anything on this kid, Charles said. He'd stopped by my office to fill me in on what was happening with the case. I don't think she did it. Not sure who did it or why, but the beef between her and Kara is some weird half-sibling competition or retaliation against Madeline. Gotta agree with you, there's no proof that Danica had anything to do with her mother's death. In fact, she can't talk about Liza Abernathy without tearing up. She's convinced that Madeline Price did it, but there's no reason to believe she was involved either. I hate I took this case. Why? You've worked it hard. You've done a great job, Syl. But there's a man who is waiting for me to tell him I found his wife's killer. He's expecting me to bring this thing home, and I just can't seem to break the case. I failed. Charles sat down opposite me. There was nothing left to say. I had failed. It was time to tell Carson that his wife's killer hadn't been identified, and probably wouldn't ever be found. What else has Danica said? Basically, she said that she and Liza had an argument over making their relationship public. Danica wanted to be her daughter all the time, not just when Liza slipped below 8 Mile Road. Well, according to Danica, she was planning on going public, revealing that they were mother and daughter. So Liza stayed there arguing with her. Eventually, Liza followed her into an alley, and the two almost came to blows, but before anything could happen, a black Monte Carlo pulled up. Someone got out dressed in black, ski mask and all, and they shot Liza 5 times. A simple story. Almost too simple, but one thing stood out, the black Monte Carlo. Why was that standing out? Black Monte Carlo, I said. I only drive it on special occasions. I could be wrong. I had to be wrong. Charles? Yeah, what's wrong? You look panicked. I gotta go. What do you mean? Where are you going? I shoved the paperwork aside, jumped up, grabbed my keys, and ran to the car. If I hurried, I'd make it there before 5 p.m. I hit M14, got stuck in gridlock traffic, and got off the highway at 4:45. I pulled into the parking lot at 4:57. Liza Stark was walking out of the office, striding confidently in a pinstripe suit. I pulled into a parking stall, threw the car into park, and jumped out. Liza continued to walk, as if she had not seen my car. Mrs. Stark. I yelled at her back. Liza turned around, slipping her sunglasses low on her nose. Mrs. Wilcox. I've been expecting you. Why is that? You're sharp. Are you admitting? I am very happy that you caught Liza's murderer. She's young, I hope she gets a short sentence. She deserves a second chance. How do you know about that? You'd be surprised what I know. She's not guilty. No? Then why did you have the police arrest her? She asked sarcastically. You're not going to let a 15-year-old girl take the fall for you, are you? Mrs. Wilcox, I have no idea what you're talking about. Not driving the Monty today. Nice cutlass. Aileen smiled and shook her head. Remember, I told you I only drive the Monte Carlo on special occasions? Like when you go out to kill your daughter-in-law? That's a terrible thing to say. Carson loved her. He'll love again. How could you be so cold? Thanks for stopping by, Mrs. Wilcox, but if you don't mind, I have to. You set her up. Mrs. Wilcox. You set up a young girl. Your daughter-in-law's child. You were the one who was harassing Madeline. Why would I ever do that? Because you didn't want anyone to know that you murdered Liza, least of all your son. Aileen Stark let out a loud, angry laugh before saying, no one would tell a son that his mother murdered his wife. Think about how horrible that would be. There might be one person who thinks it's important for him to know, even if it is painful. That same person has too much compassion to do that. Good day, Mrs. Wilcox. Aileen Stark, Liza Stark's killer, climbed into her car and drove away. I gave all the information I'd gathered to DPD, but knew there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. Aileen Stark was 77 years old and rich. The odds of her doing any time in jail were slim to none. The odds that the prosecutor would ever move forward were even less likely. Danica also escaped the prosecution for Liza's murder, because there was no evidence tying her to the crime. She was sentenced to 3 months in a residential treatment center for what she did to Kara, the short stay a result of Kara and Madeline advocating for her to receive a lighter sentence. I put off the inevitable for a few weeks, but eventually, I had to return Carson's phone calls and set up a meeting. It wasn't satisfying to know who the killer was without being able to do anything about it, but I hadn't taken the case with the idea that it would ever make it to trial. I'd taken it because I wanted to find out the truth for Carson. How are you going to tell him? Martin asked. I'm not. He's going to figure it out for himself. How? By connecting the dots. But, Martin, I'm not telling him that his mother killed his wife. He will figure it out. It will be one of those. I felt emotion well up in my throat. Money was not enough. Nothing was enough for a mother to cause her son such pain. I guess you're right, but I would want to know the truth even if it was terrible. Martin's words struck me. Was knowing the truth always helpful? Was the truth better than hearing a comfortable lie? I didn't have the answers to those questions. Carson Stark is a surgeon, he will figure it out. Why do you think she did it? That was a great question. After running the situation through my head repeatedly, I was still confused about it. Why would a mother do this to her son? The alternate answer was even worse. There's a good chance, that the bullets weren't meant for Liza. What? Why do you think that? If Aileen Stark had wanted to kill Liza, she would have done it before she married Carson. But even more importantly, she wasn't going to have Danica ruining their good name. If Danica made herself known, word would have gotten around. Aileen Stark cares about keeping up appearances and keeping as much money in the family as possible. Danica could have demanded money to keep things quiet. Exactly, and Aileen Stark wasn't about to let that happen. Sick. I know. I don't know how Carson is going to react, but I can't stall any longer. Carson was waiting at the door with a tall glass of Solis and orange juice. He offered me a drink, which I declined, before placing my briefcase on the table and pulling out a stack of reports detailing what I'd learned. You know who did it? Please sit down. Is it that bad? Just, Mr. Stark, just please have a seat. I will read the summary. There was no softening the blow of the information. Instead of drawing out the details, I raced through the brief paragraphs. Carson doubled over and cried when I told him about Danica, his eyes searing with the pain of betrayal. I gave him time to cry for a few minutes before I continued. As I explained the details surrounding Danica, Carson interrupted. "Where is Danica now?" "She's in a treatment center for a few months." "I want to meet her." "Okay. I think she'd like that. I can give you her information." "When did she find Liza?" "About a year before Liza was murdered. Danica wanted to be a part of her life. She wanted to meet you and the kids, her uncle, aunt, cousins, and grandparents. Liza was afraid you wouldn't accept her, so she kept Danica in the shadows longer than she would have liked. Danica was threatening to show up and expose the secret, which scared Liza. On the day Liza died, she went to meet with Danica. They spent hours arguing in an abandoned building. Eventually, Danica left in anger. Liza didn't want to leave Brightmoor until they had settled things. She looked for Danica and eventually found her by a party store. Danica headed into the alley, Liza followed. Then a car appeared, a black 1982 Monte Carlo. Carson looked at me with a blank stare that gave way to eyes full of terror. The bullets were meant for Danica, but Liza jumped in front of her. She sacrificed her life for her firstborn. It was so hard to look Carson in the eye, but I couldn't bring myself to look away. There was nothing else to say or do. Compassionate eye contact was the one thing I could give him. Having reached an understanding, we sat in comfortable silence. It was the type of quiet you find yourself in when a truth is too true, too bitter. After about 10 minutes, I set a sealed envelope of Carson's copy of the paperwork on the table, closed my briefcase, and turned to leave. "Sylvia," Carson said, catching my shoulder. I turned around and faced him. He'd never used my first name before. "Your payment." "Carson?" This was the first time I'd slipped up and called him by his first name, thereby dropping the protective professional barrier. "No. Fair is fair. You've more than done your job. I have answers, and that was all I wanted." Carson grabbed a checkbook from the table and wrote a check for much more than he owned. "Carson, this is too much." No, it's not enough. You don't know what you've done for me." "I don't." "You proved my wife was a good person, that she loved me, and that she died because she loved her daughter, not because she was seeing someone else. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you." He pressed the folded check into my palm. Not knowing what to do with all the emotions, I simply nodded, turned, and swiftly headed for the door. Carson called my name before I could step out. "I want to meet Danica. Can you arrange that?" I hesitated, not because I wasn't willing to help bring the two of them together, but because I was in awe. He'd just received devastating news, but he still had the heart to worry about a child he'd never met, a true man of substance. "Of course. I'll set something up." As I left Carson's office, the weight of his gratitude and the overwhelming generosity of the check he had given me lingered in my mind. The drive back home was a blur, my thoughts consumed with the intricate web of emotions that had unfolded throughout this case. 19. "Just remember you're a pie, not a social worker," Charles said. It had been 4 months since the close of Liza's case. Charles and I were sitting at Mickelson's, enjoying iced tea and fish and chips. "I know. I just want to spark the healing process." "That's very noble. I guess that's why you're a pie. You've got time to play the social worker if you want. How many cases you working right now?" "Currently, I'm taking a bit of a break." "That's not like you. Case took a lot out of you, huh?" "Yeah, it was rough. Never expected it to turn out the way it did. Made me think about Martin and the..." "Stop. You don't need to feel sorry about that. You did the right thing. It's better that he doesn't know all the details. Derek committed suicide. That's all he needs to know." "Well, whether or not it's better, I'm not in a hurry to change things." "How about a vacation? You could book a flight to anywhere. A few weeks on a white sandy beach. Could be exactly what the doctor ordered." It sounded like a good choice. Maybe after I straighten things out here. It would be nice to take some time and get away for a while. So what's the plan for this afternoon? I'm meeting Danica at her aunt's house. From there, we're going to Carson's. He's asked me to stay for the first part of the meeting, but if things go well, I'll take off and the four of them will be left to bond. You'll ride off into the sunset. That's right. Syl. Yeah? You're an angel. Alyssa's master's home was buzzing with activity when I arrived. There were a few children riding bikes out front. I pulled up as a preteen flew out of the house, letting the screen door smack against the doorframe. Danica was out front, cross-legged, sitting on the concrete, engrossed in her cell phone. She was wearing skinny jeans, a black t-shirt with "Yes" on the front, and a gray windbreaker. She looked up when I honked the horn, and gave a slight wave before slipping the phone into her pocket and heading my way. "Hey," she said, her voice shaking a bit. "Hi, Danica. You ready?" "Guess so." "All right. Climb on in." Summer had been filled with hot days oscillating between torrential downpours, but the weather had recently turned. It was one of the first autumn-like days we'd experienced, and the weather was overcast and cool, with a hint of rain in the air. The change had put me in a relaxed, peaceful mood. A cool breeze crept into the car as Danica zipped up her windbreaker before climbing into the Taurus. We drove in silence for the first 15 minutes, but as we approached the on-ramp for M14, Danica asked, "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" "Kara? Maybe in time. Just give her time and remember that she's hurting too." "I want to know her. We're family." "Yes, you are. But just remember that you lived without knowing about one another for more than a decade, and your first meeting was not that positive." "I just didn't know what to do. I was scared and sad." I nodded my head, not sure how to respond. Danica had been through so much already, and she was just a teenager. Over the months, I had forgiven Danica for lying about not recognizing the picture of Liza, and stopping by to interrogate my priest, but the crimes against Kara were much more egregious. There was a chance that Kara would never want to see her again. I wasn't sure what would help soothe her pain. "Forgive yourself," I said. "Do that first. After that, work on mending relationships." Carson was outside when we arrived. He was clean-shaven and dressed in neat, pleated khakis and a blue polo shirt. Before we got out of the car, Carson crossed the driveway and stood beside my car door. "Sylvia, it's good to see you," he said in a low, subdued tone. Carson Stark had become something of a friend. It probably wasn't the best idea to mix business with pleasure, but all payments had been made, and we were both lonely adults, hurting and missing our dead spouses. I nodded and smiled. Danica opened her car door and stepped out onto the gravel. "Carson Stark, meet Danica Masters," I said, motioning for Danica to come over to our side of the car. "Hello, Danica," Carson said, holding out his hand. Danica took it and gave him a firm handshake, but she wouldn't look up at his face. "Well, we have a lot to catch up on. Is it okay if we head inside? I have a few people I'd like you to meet." "Sure," Danica muttered. I followed behind the two. Carson looked back, giving a look that said it was okay to leave. "I am going to run a few errands. Danica, is it okay if I come back in an hour to pick you up?" The confused look on Danica's face caused me to wonder if I'd made a mistake getting involved in helping Carson and Danica connect. "Danica, do you?" "It's okay." I returned 40 minutes later to find Danica and her half-siblings playing with Legos. Carson was watching with a smile on his face. The visit must have gone well, because Danica ended up wanting to stay longer than an hour. After she said goodbye to her brother and sister and Carson, we headed out. Before I could close the door, Carson called my name. "Yeah? If you have time tomorrow, maybe we can get lunch? My treat." I hesitated. "Carson, It's just lunch, Syl. I'm not on bended knee or anything like that." We both laughed. I needed more laughs, more friends in the world. So I said yes. The end. Please stay tuned for a sample chapter of Fracture, the next book in the series. Chapter 1. Clem Robertson stuck the iPod in the back pocket of her faded jeans. The little first-generation device blasted Tom Petty, singing about an American girl. She crooned at the top of her lungs, swinging her arms and rocking her hips from side to side before sweeping her golden gray-streaked hair up to the crown of her head. She pulled her hair into a bun and let out a short, forceful whistle. The two dogs, a border collie and a German shepherd, Bennett and Milo, raised their heads. She grabbed a travel mug, filled it with coffee, and snapped on the top. She looked at the waiting dogs. "Come on if you're coming," she said, as she slipped her subcompact Glock 9mm and a few personal protection rounds into the holster around her waist. On her way out, she snagged a bath towel and pushed the door of the old Airstream trailer open. The dogs rushed after her, jumping out of the trailer and running ahead. The sun was already beating down on the desert near Lund, Utah. Clem had called this vast, isolated landscape home for 5 years, and she'd never been happier. This area was much more suitable for her than the previous place she'd camped. The fewer eyes, the better. It only took one noisy tourist, or a kid, recording her location with their cell phone and uploading it to the stupid internet, to ruin her life. That was why she was several miles outside of Lund. People drove through the ghost town and rummaged through the ruins regularly. Clem made sure she was far enough away that the casual explorer wouldn't find her. But Clem was aware she had a charmed life. Her days began when she woke up. There wasn't an alarm clock or a job waiting for her, and no one nagging her about cooking breakfast or anything else. She fed Bennett and Milo on her schedule, made her coffee, and settled into the day. If she wanted to run a few miles, she did that. If she wanted to spend a lazy day sitting out front of her camper, she was free to do so. As far as necessities went, hunting in the fall always kept the freezer full. Of course, she didn't bother with the government's ridiculous hunting licenses. It was the one time during the year Clem would put on makeup and curl her hair. She had yet to run into a wildlife division official who wanted to check her credentials. She'd turn on the charm and keep the conversation going until the official moved on. Implementing a strict carnivore diet had made it easy to live off the grid and in the desert, because it eliminated all grocery store trips. She drank water, had coffee shipped to a P.O. box, and ate wild game. That day Clem made her way to the hot springs near the spot she'd temporarily claimed 5 years ago. There had once been hot springs all throughout the area, but most had dried up because of an extended drought. She'd stumbled upon a few hot pots near a geothermal factory one day when she was out running. She couldn't bathe there because it was too hot, but she would gather water in her jug and let it cool for a while. After that, Clem would strip off her clothes and pour the water over her body. She loved how free she felt, shedding her clothes and living life on her terms. Most days she was completely alone, and she loved it. The geothermal plant was out in the distance, and there were a few pig farms a couple of miles south, but the desert had turned out to be the perfect place to hide. Other stragglers that roamed around Lund knew her as Priscilla. She told an overly friendly waitress at a diner in Cedar City that was her name. Priscilla had rolled off her tongue. She'd been listening to Elvis all day long, so Priscilla was the first name to come to mind. There were, of course, some people were curious about who she was. Now and then, rockhounds searching for geodes or someone retracing the Pony Express route stumbled upon her little piece of heaven. She was friendly to a point, but kept the 9mm close, just in case someone got too nosy. So far, no one had required her to deal with them. Clem's removal from modern society, and all its inhabitants, was working out just fine. She explored the desert during the day, stargazed at night, read the few books she'd shuffled into the RV before setting her foreclosed home on fire, and lived a peaceful life with her dogs. Leaving the world behind had been easy for Clem. She'd seen the writing on the wall with the signing of the Patriot Act. Clem and her husband had both been working at a military base, and they saw firsthand what was coming down the pipeline. That was when she started downsizing and rolling back the hands of time. She sold her 2007 Jeep Cherokee and purchased a 1949 Jeep Willys. She disconnected the internet, destroyed her cell phone and tried to convince her husband Harry that time was running thin. They needed to move fast. Something's going down soon. I can feel it. We should start thinking about moving off-grid. We could settle in the desert and become self-sufficient. That might be the only way to avoid the worst of it. Clem, we have a life here. What are you talking about? Stop listening to those conspiracy theorists, Harry said. After a few years of fighting about whether the government was systematically stripping them and everyone else in the country of their fundamental rights, Clem had come home from a local militia meeting to find a note on the kitchen table. Clem, this isn't what I signed up for. I don't want a divorce, but I need some time away. When you are ready to talk, please call me, or use a carrier pigeon, or whatever means you deem appropriate for communication since you destroyed your cell phone. We can start taking trips to the desert and spend time there, but we live in a house in Tooele and we love it. Our kids and friends live close, and frankly, I don't see why you can't recognize all our blessings. I am willing to reconcile, but a few things have to happen. First, try to get your old job at the base back. It's far-fetched, but I think I can pull some strings. Next, you absolutely must stop listening to that whack job guy who was talking about chemicals in the water changing the sex of frogs, and you need to drop out of that weird militia you're a part of. You know that puts my job at the base at risk. I can't have a wife who is delusional about what's happening with the government. I have the number of a good psychiatrist, and if you need some time somewhere quiet to think, we can arrange that. I love and miss my wife. Please come back. Clem had read the letter once, turned on a stove burner, waited until the coil was red hot, and dropped the paper onto the glowing element. The charred paper floated onto the kitchen floor. Clem watched for a moment, but quickly switched her thoughts to her next move. A few suitcases filled with clothes, guns, and books were sitting in her bedroom closet. She rushed upstairs, grabbed her belongings, and threw them into the old Ford F-250 they used to pull the Airstream. Working quickly, she climbed into the truck, backed it close to the trailer, and latched it to the hitch. She hated double towing, but she needed the Jeep Willys too. After she got the Jeep and trailer situated, she grabbed a gas can from the garage and doused the kitchen with gasoline. It was necessary. After she left, Harry would probably call the police and report her missing. They'd look for clues about where she'd gone. Harry would immediately assume she'd gone to Overton, Nevada, where her sister lived, but no one, not even her sister, understood what was coming. Everyone thought she was crazy. She wasn't sure she could trust anyone, even the militia members. She'd get in touch with them if she needed anything, but right now, she just needed to move. Clem grabbed the rest of the notepad and lit it on fire from the stove. Then she tossed it onto the floor and watched the flame spread in a square. I really poured the gasoline in straight lines. Good job, she thought, heading out the door. Now 7 years on, Clem was sure no one was looking for her. After a few months in the West Desert, she'd realized she needed to be somewhere more secluded. That prompted her to torch the F-250, get an old 1970s Ford F-150, and pull the Airstream and Willys into the desert near Lund, Utah. A few years back, she'd gotten a few puppies from a man named Jack, who raised dogs while squatting in various properties left over from windswept ghost towns. Now and then, when she felt lonely, she'd drive 50 miles to his place and they'd spend a few nights together. He was at least 15 years her junior, but they'd never discussed age or anything else personal. Jack was what she called him, but it probably wasn't his name. Clem didn't care. He was accessible when she wanted to be bothered, and not around when she didn't feel like company, the ideal relationship in her eyes. As Clem reflected on her current state of being, a smile spread across her face. Life was good. Clem's thoughts returned to the present as she took in the bright blue morning sky. The quiet beauty of the desert captivated her as she trudged through sandy mounds. Walking through the soft soil was difficult, but Clem was proud she was in good enough shape to push forward without much trouble. It would take about 45 minutes for the water from the hot springs to get to a temperature of her liking. While she waited, she'd rockhound, play with the dogs, or search for items left behind by reckless explorers. She'd found money, just change, but it all mattered, articles of clothing she'd rehabbed, furniture and books. It was surprising to see some of the things people called junk. The dogs, who had been trained well enough not to run after the wild horses anymore, would lie at the end of the hot pot waiting for her to finish her bath. But on this day, Milo took off just as the hot pots came into sight. "Milo! Get back here," she yelled, using the sternest voice she had. Milo was hard to control at times. He was only a year old. Bennett, who was 5, tried to teach him how to behave, but the dog had a mind of his own. "What's gotten into him?" she asked Bennett, but as if on cue, he ran off behind Milo, disappearing into the desert. Stunned, Clem ran back to her camp, jumped in the Jeep Willys, and took off in the direction the dogs had run. She couldn't see them, but she heard the cacophony of barks in the distance. "No treats for you two tonight," she muttered to herself, pushing the Jeep over the sand. After a few minutes, she saw the dogs at the edge of a ravine, both barking viciously. "Quit your barking," she yelled as she parked. Clem was about to get out and round up the dogs when something stopped her. She froze and waited to make sure she was correct. Yes. That was the smell of decomposition. The only question now was if it was an animal or something else. She took a few more steps and spotted a filthy rag of a dress with floral patterns, ripped and blowing in the breeze. The emaciated body and needle-thin arms stretched out above the body, as if the person had lifted their arms in surrender before being killed. Clem moved closer, her heart beating wildly. Milo approached behind her. "Get back!" she yelled at the dog, holding up her hand to let the dogs know she meant business. 2 more steps forward, and she could see the eyes were wide with what could only be described as primal fear. The mouth, drawn and gaping open, caused Clem to yelp as if in pain. This person had suffered. Something terrible had happened. An object, shiny and broken, caught her eye. She wasn't sure what it was, a necklace maybe, but it looked like it might be worth some money. She inched closer, debating whether or not she should take the glistening piece of jewelry. If she took it to a pawn shop in Nevada, she could probably get a decent amount for it. Clem stepped down into the ravine, held her breath, swiped up the broken pieces of the object, and rushed back towards the dogs. Thank you for listening to this sample of Fracture.